A little later on, Soft Steel the wood dwarf came by the booth, making no effort to wish the kids a good day. He was about to walk by without a word. "Excuse me," George called after him. "What is it?" the wood dwarf asked, turning round. "Do you like lemonade?" the stag inquired. "I certainly do," replied the dwarf, sceptically peering at the mice and the stag. "And now I suppose you want me to pay." "But you choose how much," Jess clarified. "Pah! On top of all that I have to choose," the dwarf groaned, pulling a face and pretending to be bored. "Maybe you'd like to carve something?" George asked. He knew that dwarves were fine craftsmen who probably put all their sensitivity into their craft and hadn't much left over for other occasions. "You want something carved?" the dwarf asked the mice. Lars handed Soft Steel the shiny acorn, and the dwarf eyed the material. Then he pulled the knife from his belt pouch and asked, "And what should I carve for you?" Lars looked around. His eye fell on George, standing next to him, looking very regal. Lars whispered something to Jess that his brother seemed to think was a good idea. "Carve us a George," Jess said. "All right. Well, get yourself into a proper pose," the dwarf demanded. So George took up an even more regal pose, and Soft Steel began to carve. From time to time he looked up at George and then continued carving. Eventually he blew the shavings from the acorn's surface, took a critical look at his work, and then showed it to the mice. The dwarf had captured a good likeness of George on the shiny acorn. A fine work. Jess took the acorn and thanked the dwarf respectfully. "My lemonade," Soft Steel said, pointing at the empty glass on the counter. He made no effort to make this sound like a request. The children poured him some lemonade, the dwarf gulped the glass down in one go and left. When he was sure that he was out of sight and earshot, however, Soft Steel smacked his lips loudly, since the lemonade had been truly delicious. "Now we have a really valuable acorn," Lars cheered. Mrs. Mouse came out of her house to look for her grandchildren and was happy to see George with them. The kids showed her their new carving, and she immediately recognized George's image. Since he had had such a good idea, the stag was given the rest of the lemonade. Jess took the jug and poured it directly into his mouth, as stags rarely have their hands free. "Another satisfied customer," George commented, licking his lips. "And as a customer, I choose what I pay. So, why don't we go lantern rambling tonight? What do you think, Mrs. Mouse?" "Oh, I haven't done that for a long time," the old lady said, wondering if this wasn't a touch too adventurous. Then she said, "As long as we take it slowly. My legs aren't what they used to be." "Yay!" Jess shouted. "Hooray!" said Lars. George promised to pick the mice up at twilight. Lantern rambling is an old tradition in Mousewood. When the days get shorter, the forest dwellers light colourful paper lanterns with their children and go for an evening walk. After sunset, Lars and Jess put on warm coats and waited outside. Mrs. Mouse joined them and gave her grandchildren sticks to hang their lanterns on. The little ones could hardly wait for George to take them and their granny for a walk through the forest. Mrs. Mouse picked up the lanterns and unfolded them. Then she put candles inside and lit them. Lars got his first. It was shaped like the sun, with a jolly, illuminated face. The flickering candle flame made the sun's smile curiously vivid. Then Granny Mouse hung Jess's lantern on its stick, a radiant crescent moon gazing dreamily into the night. The children held their lanterns carefully so the candles would burn brightly and steadily. "Okay, take good care of your lanterns," Mrs. Mouse said. "You can wait outside for George, but stay near the house." "Yes, Granny," Jess said. Mrs. Mouse returned to the kitchen to prepare dinner, since everybody was sure to be hungry after their walk. Outside, Lars and Jess waited with their lanterns for their friend. George is certainly taking his time, said Lars, cautiously dangling his lantern. Yeah, I hope he's all right, Jess replied. Do you know where he lives? Lars asked with a worried look. Somewhere over there, I think, his brother said, pointing down the forest path which disappeared into the dusk. We could go and meet him halfway. But Granny said we should wait here, said Lars. We'll go and meet him and come back to pick up Granny, Jess said. His little brother found that quite reasonable. So the two mice walked slowly down the track with their lanterns till all one could see was a jolly sun and a dreamy moon dancing faintly in the trees. Shortly after, George the Stag arrived at Mrs. Mouse's house and knocked at the door. The grandmother greeted him warmly. Good evening. Are you all ready? She asked him, and took her warm coat from the hook by the door. I'm ready, George replied. Where are Lars and Jess? Asked Mrs. Mouse, buttoning her coat. She felt a little uneasy. Why, they're not outside, if that's what you mean, George said, now sharing her unease. Mrs. Mouse ran outside and looked around. There was no sign of her grandchildren. Where are they? They were out here a minute ago, she said, her voice shaking. The old lady desperately looked about for the children. George's stomach ached at the thought that Lars and Jess were out there in the dark on their own. Come on, we've got to find them, George said, and knelt down to let Mrs. Mouse climb on his back. Granny Mouse wrapped her scarf around her neck and didn't hesitate for a second before climbing on the stag's back. Hold on tight, George said. Then he got up and moved off into the darkness in search of the children. Lars! George shouted through the nocturnal forest. Jess! Mrs. Mouse shouted. But there was no answer to be heard, nor lantern to be seen. Where are you? Their grandmother called as loud as she could. They came across some other animals, like Conrad the owl and a couple of polecats, but none of them had seen the kids. And so the stag ran through the woods with the grandmother mouse on his back, shouting their names in the dark. Fallen leaves whirled into the air behind them as the stag dashed through the dusky trees. Soon they'd covered a great deal of the neighbourhood, so the stag went into the deeper, less populated parts of the forest. But still there was no trace of the two mice. Should we search somewhere else? George asked, worried, scanning the shadows. I don't know, Mrs. Mouse said in a low voice. Then something occurred to her. Wait, I've just remembered where I used to sit with my husband, she said hopefully. Where's that? The stag asked. Mrs. Mouse tried to remember, and the stag wondered how the old lady planned to find the way in the dark. Just go straight on, she said, as if she could see the place in front of her. So George went straight on. Suddenly they emerged from the trees in a glade, the same glade where George had talked to the raven that morning. The huge tree towered on the other side of the clearing, bathed in pale moonlight. George ran over to the tree. This is where I used to sit with my husband, right under that tree when we were young. It's so long since I've been here. George, can you see the little ones? Asked Mrs. Mouse with hope in her voice. My eyesight isn't what it used to be. Is there someone there? George peered over at the tree, and down at the bottom of the trunk there was indeed somebody. He struggled to see who it was. Then he made out two figures, but not Jess and Lars. George didn't know if he could trust his eyes. Down in the shadows sat a young girl mouse and her boyfriend. They were holding hands and smiled shyly at him. The young mouse reminded him of the grandmother on his back. Next to the couple stood a stag, but George could only see his silhouette in the shadows cast by the silvery moonlight. Curiously, it felt like looking into a mirror. The tree remembers us, he thought, reminded of the raven's words. "It's not the kids," he said quietly to the grandmother. "Then let's ask these nice people if they've seen my grandchildren," said Mrs. Mouse, wondering why George was so quiet. "Have you seen 2 children?" George asked aloud. The mice pointed to the right into the forest. The other stag paced around in the tree's shade, calling to someone up in the treetop. George couldn't hear what he said as he was too far away. A big bird descended from the high branches, flapping towards George and Mrs. Mouse. In the moonlight, George recognized the raven he had met that morning. "Follow me, will you?" called the raven, soaring over their heads in the direction the mice had pointed. Mrs. Mouse held on tight, and George trotted across the meadow to the glade's edge. The black raven flew between the trees, his silhouette merging with the forest's darkness. George followed him. When they were back in the woods, the raven disappeared. Instead, they saw a smiling sun and a sleepy moon floating between the trees, as if waiting for something. "Children!" Mrs. Mouse called from the stag's back. "Granny!" the children shouted, running towards them, but carefully so their lanterns wouldn't go out. "You were supposed to stay at the house," their grandmother said, with a mixture of anger and relief. The kids looked sheepish and apologized. "Where were you, anyway?" George asked, slightly out of breath due to all the running and yelling. "We were looking for you," Lars explained. "But it seems you were somewhere completely different." George and Mrs. Mouse and the kids made their way through the dark forest. After a while, they found the track leading to Granny Mouse's home. They didn't talk much on the way, as it had been an exhausting evening for all of them. Around them, the woods were so silent that all that could be heard was the soft rustling of leaves beneath their feet. Just before they reached the house, Lars' lantern went out with a faint fizzle. The jolly sun went dark. Shortly afterwards, Jess's sleepy moon also expired. George was relieved that the candles had lasted so long. Without their light, they wouldn't have been able to find the children so easily in the dark. When they reached the mice's house, George bade them farewell. The house was far too small for a stag, and he was also very tired. After saying goodbye, the mice had dinner and went to bed. When Lars and Jess had brushed their teeth and crawled under their warm blankets, Granny Mouse assured them that she wasn't angry any more. She was just happy to have them back, safe and sound. The children had to promise their grandmother not to run away again. Then she tucked them in and put the lights out. And shortly after, both little mice fell asleep. Their granny waited for a while, listening to Jess mumble in his sleep. He already seemed to be dreaming. The old lady went downstairs, and later, sitting in her armchair, she looked around her. On a cupboard stood pictures of her children and grandchildren. One showed a girl mouse and her husband. Next to them lay the shiny acorn carved with George's image. George was probably at home now, Mrs. Mouse thought, also probably recovering from a tiring evening. She greatly appreciated the stag's help in finding the little ones. And after a while, Mrs. Mouse fell asleep in her armchair. In every forest there is a tree. The first tree in the whole forest. So old it knows almost everything, with roots deep in every corner of the forest, even in the realm of our thoughts and dreams. Sevenths.
Nope, that was important. I sure as hell didn't listen to it. Let's go back to some gameplay, huh? What the hell was I doing? Alright, the windows are open to help air out the apartment, even though it's like fucking 90 degrees outside. It smells really bad. So, if you hear any outside noises, sorry. Wings, huh? I mean, it's either birds or annoying shit people out in the parking lot. Or both sometimes.
Let's see if this works. Hey, presto! A stairway! I'll admit it, I totally impressed myself. Of course, a mushroom escalator would have been even better. Whoa, I'm pretty high up here. And it's cold. Ah, who's he then? Scary Mothman. And the entrance behind him looks strange too. I can almost hear a whisper. Very. Come closer. I've swallowed a portal. Another one. I think that was it.
Yay.
Ooh, it's dark in there. I can see something glowing at the end of the tunnel. I sure hope that's the portal and not something else. Fast asleep, broad daylight. Sometimes I wish I could do that instead of going to school. Then I could stay up all night reading comic books. The passage is closed. They seem to be nocturnal around here. Maybe I should drop a pebble so I can hear how long it takes before it hits the ground. That way, I can find out just how deep the abyss is. What if I hit a mouse on the head? And anyway, I'm a magician now, so I should throw something like a ball of lightning to see how long it takes. Though I guess any mice down there would probably like that even less than a pebble. Excuse me, I'm looking for a tree portal. Have you got something like that in your nest? And if you do, could I see it? Or pass through it? Is that a yes? Blink 0 times for a yes. Maybe you can't hear me. Hello, Mr. Moth. I would like to ask you something. I always have to speak up like that with my granny too. And if you yell loud enough, anything can sound important.
No wingless beings in here.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mrs. Moth. What was that? Wingless?
Your vibes are disturbing this place.
Oh. I'm not sure what that means, but I believe this is a private area for insects. Too bad I don't have any wings. I'd better ask before I burst in there. Looks like that moth over there is guarding the entrance. Miss Moth?
No, no wingless beings in here.
Oh well.
Your vibes.
I'm not sure what that, but I believe too bad I... Whoa! I feel this funny trickle.
Greetings of the night.
Yeah, same to you.
I say, you have a glorious pair of wings.
I do?
Please, forgive me for overlooking them earlier. Here we were, assuming that in this strange land that we call home now, sentient winged beings existed beside ourselves.
Ooh, I can feel the wings. But I think I'm just imagining them. Although the moth can see them too. So this is what it feels like to be Kitsuna. I wonder what her true shape is then. And what is she doing right now? Will I see her again soon?
You are carrying on a dialogue with yourself, native. Priestess Phosphora awaits you in the temple. She will derive great pleasure from greeting a native moth.
Okay. I'll just walk on through then, alright?
Just follow the path that is laid out for you, as do we. Here we were, as you priest.
It's really cold here. Oh, that must be Priestess Phosphora. What noise does a moth make anyway? Beautiful night tonight, isn't it?
My Irish fossils. Do they deceive me? Is it a moth that goes there?
Yes. What else could it be?
Hespera let you in, but she is not in distress. The air tells me so. You must be a moth of good will.
Yes, I am. Phew. For a moment there, I was afraid the spell would only work on one moth at a time.
Whence do you come? You are not part of our circle. Moreover, your master. You are not there yet.
Nope, not yet. I'm from very far away.
We bid you well. But know that it is only hardship that still keeps us in this cold place.
Oh man, it's freezing up here. It's even snowing a bit. That's probably the reason why Plato's bike froze in the puddle down there. The cold seems to emanate directly from the trees. This pot contains some dirt, but no plant. Only a funny stone that someone... Oh, my mistake. This used to be a plant. Is that one of you?
It is an image of our high priestess, Moon.
She looks very pretty, just like moonlight.
She has always been like that. And she will be once again, as soon as she enters.
How can you know that if she's still in her egg?
Comes and goes, just like the moon. We know her well, and her time will come again. Soon.
Weird statue. There's a little stone face too. Very excellent. A bundle of flax. A duster, perhaps. I think I'll borrow it.
You want to give it back?
Do you have a cloth I could use?
The cold by that tree is indeed bursting forth from another world. These days, however, only the warm light from our high priestess, resting will be able to open this frozen. She knows that we need to be on our way soon, but without nourishment there is little hope that she would ever survive.
What do you need?
Flower seeds.
Flower seed? It can't be all that hard. Are you two the only ones living here?
We used to be many. We feasted on nectar, the light of the moon, our legends, and the beauty of science. But the great flood overcame the world we inhabited.
So you fled to Mousewood.
This place is bountiful with the vibes of peace and light. We erected a temple to achieve this great healing. But the grey mountain on the horizon spells doom for this world.
rest of you go?
Drawn by the grey mountain, by stench and disease, the tools came. In time, there were too many of them, and the corruption within the things they ate that oozed into their feathers made them forget all about themselves. Our wings resemble the bark of the trees, but they are not moving so far.
The Grey Flood?
The giants rolling up are the first sign, apparently peaceful, but then a mass starts to pour from their maws. Nobody gets away, be it plant or animal, because the mass hardens, thus never releasing whatever lies buried underneath.
Sounds like cement to me. Could that be what she's talking about?
Maybe a volcano.
And why are you wearing those masks?
Like the moon, we cover our features, for only by looking inward can the ghost undergo a new change. It symbolizes our retreat from the world and our focus on the inner.
Let's talk about something else. What are you guarding so closely?
It is the last will. We are the last of the nuns of the Moonlight Circle. We are expecting the arrival of our high mistress, who is conceived under a favorable star. Begotten by the most light-filled moths within our circle, we are going to call her Moon.
Moonlight. What a beautiful name. It was nice talking to you, but now I need to buzz off. Do other insect stuff.
Return here whenever you are able to, but try to not tarry for too long. Lights are coming from everywhere, blinding us and drawing us away from here.
Fits. Nothing. There's probably nothing here that will grow.
Woohoo! Hello, Jenny. You're out and about late. Well, where to? Most schools have been evacuated because of the crows. It is especially dangerous up in the trees. Let's go. Hang on tight, Jenny. See you later.
You have found all the dewdrops. A picture is formed. The column reveals its secret.
It's a boy, about my age, and a teacher.
There was someone before you.
Before me? What? Who is that?
It is he who was banished, the last apprentice of the Marquis de Hoto.
What? Hello?
Your teacher must not find out about this. Not yet.
What does it mean? Hello? Mr. Old Magician? No, fine. Why was the picture of the Marquis' apprentice vanished from the room? And why the last one? I'm the last one. At least right now. It's a boy. The old midget, the vanished one. And he said the Marquis mustn't find out about it. Not yet. How weird.
post office by the river is on. Let's go. Hang on tight. See you later.
How appropriate that the birds outside are crows.
I'm sure my mug is an awful... I'm sure my... A mug full of thick... Now I've got a sticky brush. That does good sticky... Oh man, that's a long way down. I should do this during the day. Right, the branch is sticky now. Great, my spider sense is tingling. Now I just have to adjust the branch, and then some of those little paratroopers will hopefully land in my net. Now I need to be careful. That shoelace is... Now I just have to... Whoa! The shoelace broke. So much for my nice grappling hook. No, I've already lost my nifty grappling hook. Enough of this for today. Some dandelion seeds got stuck in the net, but I can't reach it like this, and the shoelace broke. So much for my... I'd better take...